Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Nature and Values by Edgar Sheffield Brightman, published in 1945. We just finished looking at the chapter on values, and so the first half of the book gave us structure, then chapter 4 gave us values. Now chapters 5, 6, and 7 are going to give us the closeout triad for Brightman's system. So what we have to be aware of here is that in chapter 5, when he discusses naturalism, naturalism isn't to be negated. Naturalism makes a contribution to personalism. And so we will have that contribution in the second moment of this lesson when we discuss scientific method, but the next chapter will bring on the subject of personalism. However, naturalism makes a contribution, so his closing triad is going to be chapters 5, 6, and 7. It's going to be naturalism, personalism, and the realization of value. So let's begin taking a look at this chapter, chapter 5, pages 88 to 111, and the contribution from naturalism. And we begin with block 1. We begin with the fact that we have to seek a unification of fact and reason. Every person must have some first principles to live by, and these first principles must be in harmony with each other. They support each other. So the real aim of gnosis, the real aim of the intellect, is this totality of harmony. And the self must be both a unification of the facts of experience with the laws of reason. So Brightman says that openness to God demands devotion and worship. In other words, we begin with the conviction of state of mind always. We always begin with the motivational base, or that conviction of the heart, which is called state of mind. And for the believer, that means it's a state of mind or a conviction of the heart of one of devotion and worship to Christ and to Christ's kingdom. Now note too, the unification of the state of mind, we do seek to define the unity of the world, and that means along with it we want to define unity of the soul, unity of the self. And he says when we look to the prayer of Christ in John 17, where Christ actually prays for unity to the Father, that they might be one in us. And so Brightman says this is a sign that we strive for this unity if we strive for kingdom. The problem of the one and many is the fundamental problem for the believer. We strive to find a unity between the world of nature and the world of personality. And Brightman finds that unity in personalism. That's where he finds that unity. So the unity of the world, in note 3, experiment begins with the definition of problem, and Brightman is superior on definitions. He's very good at giving us his definitions, which I really appreciate. He always defines his concepts as he goes. Idealists posit that mind is the energy actualization of world. Materialists posit that unconsciousness is the energy actualization of world. Today that is expressed as personalism and naturalism. Idealism is personalism, and materialism is naturalism. And so Brightman says there is a need to address naturalism and to include it and find some contribution that it can make to our overall system of personalism. Now the radical naturalism regards nature as all that there is, and scientific method is the only method for truth. But Brightman says that radical naturalism was just really a revolt against dogmatism, and he says we should agree with the fact that all views are subject to experimental testing. That's something we should agree to. So that we can take up. We reject the radical naturalism, but he says that was just a revolt against dogmatism, which Brightman is also against. He's against fundamental dogmatism. And he agrees that all views should be subject to experimental testing. And for personalism, that means testing in experience, in the realm of experience. In that, remember that dialectic of translation. So since we agree with that statement, we can move on to block 2 and look at the contribution that we can gather from a moderate naturalism, not the radical, but a moderate naturalism. We look at the concrete scientific method. The revolt of the radical naturalism was against dogmatism and Christianity. It was an objection to the view that nature is evil, and an objection to the antisocial nature of the church, the organized church. But Brightman says by the mid-19th century, naturalism had become more moderate and had become dialectical materialism, with fields of forces rather than solid theory of atoms. Experience became activity in this moderate naturalism. And the categories of matter and motion shifted to categories of event and relation. They came to posit a new notion of emergent evolution. And so under emergent evolution, this moderate naturalism emphasized continuity of processes within nature, a continuity that was not mechanical. So the moderate naturalism didn't posit mechanical necessity. And they began leaning toward the notion of being as activity. So today, naturalism is transitioning from that radical to a more moderate naturalism. It's in a state of transition. But the contribution we can gain from this moderate naturalism is scientific method, and it's fourfold, and we can take this up within personalism. It's the 4 moments of observation, description, hypothesis, and experiment. But scientific method does vary with subject matter, and so scientific method should not be conceived of in a narrow sense. And that means where there cannot be an appeal to experiment, there can still be an appeal to experience, and that's what we're going to do in personalism, says Brightman. We are going to appeal to experience as that realm of verification. That's going to be our realm of the dialectic of translation as our experiment. So a moderate naturalism makes a contribution to personalism by offering up a modified scientific method. That brings us on to block 3. So in block 3, we're going to look at theoretical unity plus concrete scientific method equals our dialectical process of verification, which is the testing of truth. All beliefs must be tested by an exact appeal to experience. If the experimental method is to be universally applied, it must be applied also to that which is beyond sensate experience. Philosophical method is also a pursuit of facts, but it pertains to the truth of the whole. Verification should not be restricted to sensate operations of testing. Critical reflective thinking should also be included in verification. Critical reflective thinking is coupled with the sensate within that dialectical process of verification. It is a time of action and reflection. Remember, praxis is action and reflection. And so that critical reflective thinking is part of praxis ministry and part of the verification that takes place within praxis ministry. But verification will lead to revision. Note 2, all judgments about persons or societies are always, to some extent, tentative concepts. We are not given to absolute knowledge. All decisions are subject to further light. We see through a glass darkly. All finite decisions are subject to divine correction, says Brightman. And so, the all-important 3-3, reflection plus revision, will bring about the return moment of a re-internalization. That ministry, that praxis of action and reflection, and then the awareness of a need for revision is going to create a return moment, a re-internalization return moment. The attentiveness of facts does not mean that commitment is forbidden. Ethical decision is necessary, even in the absence of absolute knowing. Tentativeness is fourfold. We're involved in a search for truth. We are involved in being committed to that truth. And we are also involved in learning of new truth in the midst of praxis ministry. And we are also open to revision of prior beliefs and revision to the conviction of state of mind. Scientific method must face all effects, including the ideals and the values, not just the sensate. And Brightman says reason should be coherent thinking, coherent living, and never fully realized, always ongoing dialectic. And so in conclusion, he says, we are to be consistent and non-contradictory, systematic, inclusive of all experience, analytic of all elements, and synoptic in being holistic in our approach. Holistic within our approach. So the very critical thing we need to learn here is that Brightman doesn't simply say negate naturalism. Yes, radical naturalism should be negated, but the key point for Brightman is that naturalism is transitioning from radical naturalism to moderate naturalism because it's becoming dialectical. And by becoming dialectical, we can take up in a positive way scientific method of observation, description, hypothesis, and experiment. However, at experiment, he makes the qualifying statement where there cannot be an appeal to experiment, there can be an appeal to experience. The dialectic of translation, translating ideals to values, takes place in experience. We verify our posited notions in experience. So the most significant part of this chapter and of this lesson is block 2, the concrete scientific method. That's the most significant part of the entire lesson. So I'm going to read through block 2 one more time. The revolt of radical naturalism was against dogmatism and against Christianity. It objected to the view that nature is evil, and it objected to the antisocial nature of the church. But by the mid-19th century, naturalism became moderate and became dialectical naturalism. And it emphasized fields of forces rather than the old solid theory of atoms. Experience became activity. Categories of matter and motion transitioned to categories of event and relation. And they came up with the notion of emergent evolution. They emphasized continuity of process within nature, and that process was not necessarily mechanical. They began leaning toward the notion of being as activity, and today naturalism is in a state of transition to the more moderate dialectical naturalism. Therefore, we can take up and share scientific method of observation, description, hypothesis, and experiment, but it cannot be defined in a narrow sense because it varies with subject matter, and where there cannot be an appeal to experiment, there can still be an appeal to experience. That's the truth of what we get from this 3-chapter summary. We're going to have this one on naturalism, then we have a chapter on personalism, and we'll have a chapter on value realization. But from naturalism, we gain a modified scientific method. And that's going to wrap up chapter 5, pages 88 to 111. We'll pick up next time in chapter 6.